I can't focus anymore. I'm so scatterbrained at the collapse of this country that I love on a daily basis. I cannot focus on important things because of what's happening in the country.
I agree. And I think what saved me a little bit is I don't have time to doom scroll.
Right.
And what I really think has been good for me is I try to not do that. And it seems like not doing that, then something that's been declared from the administration has been rescinded or blocked by the court by the time I hear about it, and then I don't have to worry about it.
We're rolling. We're rolling.
Calling out cat people. This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of you have the balls to stop this. Stop this.
I've got plenty of time. I have nothing else going on today.
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now.
One thing I saw you getting credit for on Reddit, a little bit of credit for, was, I forget what it was called, but a man had been in prison for like 20 or 30 years. And then what happened? He like a prosecutorial decision to like commute the sentence. I forget the details of that.
Yeah, no, it was actually under prosecuted initiated sentencing adjustment. So what we refer to as PISA. It was actually a tool that the legislature gave us in 2023. And that allows us to look at people who've been in prison for a while to see what they've done since they've been in prison and make a recommendation to the court as to whether we think their sentence should be reduced. That was the very first PISA sentence reduction in the state, by the way. And so it was granted. And I'm already diving into the weeds here a little bit. Minnesota has what's called determinate sentencing. We don't have a parole board in that, sometimes you hear of sentences like 5 to 20 years, and after 5 years, somebody goes before a parole board. We don't have that. When you're sentenced, you do 2/3 of your sentence, and there really is a very little way to reduce the sentence. And so what you sometimes see are young people going to prison for sentences that seemed appropriate at the time, but there's no way of going back and looking and seeing how they're doing and whether they're a public safety risk, whether they've rehabilitated, and whether they would be safe in the community until now. So that's PISA.
Okay. I'm sorry for starting the chit chat segment with an actual question, but I wanted to say, like, I'm surprised when the comments on Reddit are favorable to you, because I see a lot of negative comments. Whether the story is about you or not, or whether it's happening in Ramsey County or not.
Yeah. Or the state.
It's the old Obama, it's the old thanks Obama routine where it doesn't matter what is happening. It is always Mary Moriarty's fault. This is the Wedge Live podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. And my guest today is Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty, a podcaster. She was first elected as our local prosecutor here in Hennepin County in 2022, which means you're about halfway through.
Yes.
Your first term. How's it going, and why are you now a podcaster? What brought you to podcasting?
So first of all, thank you. I'm very excited to be here. So the podcast is something that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. As you know, the criminal legal system is very complicated and nuanced, and it doesn't make for good sound bites. What people typically hear and see, especially from some people, is fear-mongering, scare tactics, and it's much harder to respond with the why are we doing something, especially in a sound bite. So my thought was the podcast was a vehicle to have a longer conversation about topics that people were probably unfamiliar with. It's called We Don't Have to Choose because one thing I've noticed since I got into office and even before, there's this refrain out there, there's this narrative that there's public safety and there's whatever I'm doing over here on some other end of the spectrum. And so the idea is, no, actually the system does not keep us safe. It's actually changes and reforms and advancement that will keep us safe. So we don't have to choose between public safety and reform. And my very first guest was Professor Rachel Barco, who I thought was really important because I heard her speak years ago, and she said if the criminal legal system was a private corporation, it would have been bankrupt years ago. So she and I unpacked why it is that the criminal legal system doesn't keep us safe. In future episodes, we'll talk about what would.
I think it's a great format for you because you, as we have already hinted at, you are often caricatured. And anytime I talk to you or listen to you at length, you're bringing a lot of information, and you always sound pretty middle of the road Democrat to me. If we can get partisan here, nothing.
I don't know how I feel about that, but yes, thank you.
You're very mainstream, especially like if I listen to you for an hour. It's hard not to come away with the idea that you're mainstream. I thought it was good too, because you hear like, oh, there's an elected official with a podcast. That sounds like fun, right? But you're not really shying away from your political challenges, the criticisms you have faced. Like, you bring them up yourself and address them. And I think even if someone is skeptical of you, they might want to listen just to hear your take on some of those things. So I thought it was a great first episode. You had a real good guest, and I listened to it all the way through.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope people do listen to it. I've always been about transparency. I think that it's really important to talk about what we're doing here, in the hopes that, at least people listen and understand. They could disagree or agree, but I think what's been frustrating for me is that some of the mainstream media will report, they won't really do the reporting on the why. And so people make up their minds based on the headline or something sensationalistic without really understanding why we're doing what we're doing. And so this is an opportunity to have people understand the why, and then they can decide whether they think that that's a good thing or not.
Do we have a crime update? I see the police chief go on local news all the time giving his crime update about whether we're up, we're down, we're feeling good or bad. From your perspective, as a part of the law enforcement community, what is our crime update? Are we good or bad?
I don't think there's any good or bad in terms of anybody who's the victim of crime is going to feel that it's bad, and that they have been harmed. But the really good news is this. So I was looking up Minnesota crime trends actually on total crime, and we are actually at a decades level low. And a lot of that is a drastic reduction in property crime. And so it doesn't look like it's been since the 70s that total crime has been this low in Minnesota. In Minneapolis, what we're seeing is a reduction, I think, in property crime. I think we're pretty consistent. The thing that, and car theft has gone drastically down. What we do see going up a touch would be murders in Minneapolis. And then we are lowering shots fired or non-fatal gunshot wounds, but the murder rate did go up in Minneapolis last year, which really did buck the trend nationally because murders, I think, went down about 16%. So making a lot of progress on total crime. I mean, I think it's pretty remarkable that it's at decades level low overall. And I know that that's not necessarily the perception. Perception does matter to people, but we're doing well on some of the trends. On others, I think we could be doing much better at.
So the thing I keep my eye on is robbery, and we've seen a decrease in robbery if you want to limit it to like the first 2 months of 2025, which is, a small sample there. Because I think people using violence to take things from you, that people feel that really personally in a way like, well, you got your car stolen. That's bad. That's a huge inconvenience for you. It's not going to change your life forever in a way that violence would. what was my question here? See, I'm a bad podcaster here. I've noticed, I'm going to skip to my next question because I forgot what my first question was there. The other car crime. So aside from like carjacking and car theft, I've seen a lot of stories about like reckless and drunk driving. There was a high profile one in St. Louis Park. Is that becoming a more serious problem? Have you changed your office's approach to cases like that?
One of the really surprising things to me when I got into office was the number of what we call criminal vehicular homicides. That means somebody's in a car crash where somebody dies, or criminal vehicular operation, meaning somebody's in a car crash and somebody's seriously injured. I think it's a major problem. It is something that we are actually about to embark on a public service campaign about reckless driving. Because it is a huge problem. And even just driving around, I live in Minneapolis, and I don't think it's isolated to Minneapolis, but you do see people on the freeway. For instance, I drive home on 35W, and you can look around and you can see people on their cell phones. You can see people distracted. You can see people going really exceeding the speed limit. They look like they're going 90 or 100 miles an hour, weaving in and out of traffic. And the time it takes for some split second something to happen, you look at your phone or you're speeding and somebody pulls out in front of you, is that time when you could crash into somebody and kill them. And so we've seen these kinds of crashes over and over since I've been in office. And they are, they come out of the blue. Some person is driving around, minding, living their life. And then the next thing you know, they're gone, and they're devastating for the family and for the community. And I think there's kind of, and I think this is since COVID actually, that I think people have been speeding and much more distracted when they're driving. And I think part of it is police just haven't been really enforcing speed, some of the dangerous driving behavior, like blowing through stop signs and stoplights. And I think people have become accustomed to being able to do that without any consequences. And we just, we see it way too often. And you've talked about the Park Tavern case there. That was a DWI-related incident. But I think somehow we need to get the message across to people that, you might not think there's going to be a consequence for this dangerous driving behavior, and there probably won't in terms of you getting stopped by law enforcement. But in that second where you engage in behavior like that, you could kill someone. And that is something that you have to live with the rest of your life. So we've been trying to figure out ways, strategizing about ways to get that message out. And I think one of the things we're going to do is go to schools. To talk to students in schools this spring about driving and the consequences of that kind of driving.
So I remember what I was leading in to talk about. It was about something you mentioned on the podcast with your guest, like the certainty of getting caught, the certainty of some kind of punishment really trumps having a really draconian and severe approach to all cases. Simply a matter of, does the person get caught? Do they face any kind of consequences at all? And I'm wondering does that mean we can peg you as a supporter of hiring more police? Do you think as MPD hires up, that increases, that's a benefit to public safety because people are just more likely to get caught? Do you think so? Could we be centrist Democrats here?
Thanks for framing it that way. So what you're talking about are clearance rates.
Right.
And so that's, and I actually have that data right in front of me because I thought you might ask me that. So clearance rates, let me talk. I have a number of different kind of clearance rates here, but I happen to be looking at car theft in Minneapolis. So in 2023, there were a little over 7,500 car thefts that were reported to the Minneapolis Police Department. Clearances, and that means when law enforcement submits a case to the county attorney's office for potential charging. Doesn't mean we can actually charge it or that we have proof beyond a reasonable doubt. but they submitted to us 163 of those cases. And, some people say, well, crime is underreported, but motor vehicle theft is typically not, because people want to report it for insurance purposes and that kind of thing. So that's a clearance rate of about 2%. And I bring that up because, as you heard in the podcast, actual deterrence depends on the feeling of the person about the certainty of being caught. And so when we look at a clearance rate of 2%, what are the odds that you are going to get caught? They really are very low. Now, I want to be clear about it. It can be very difficult. It is very difficult to prove a case of car theft, in part because what we see, especially with young people, are groups of young people in a car who will drive away, ditch the car, they'll all run away, they're all wearing masks, dark clothing. It can be very difficult also to be able to prove that this is the kid or the kids who actually stole the car, or were they joyriding in the car. It might be days later. And so it can be very difficult for law enforcement to bring us a case. So this isn't criticism of law enforcement in as much as it is trying to get at the root of the problem, as to why it isn't really a deterrent to steal a car. And so this is part of why we created our youth auto theft initiative, understanding that law enforcement was having difficulty bringing us cases, yet we did need to intervene with young people who were engaging in this kind of behavior. So to your question about law enforcement, one thing that I do support is civilian investigators. And I was just talking to one of our managers about that this morning, about civilian investigators in, say, domestic violence. Civilian investigators can be incredibly helpful. They don't necessarily bring in the same vision, the same viewpoint as law enforcement, but it really is that piece of investigation that's missing much of the time. And that they don't have enough investigators. That is true. And if we really are serious about clearance rates, we do need to have investigators who have the time to thoroughly gather all the evidence. Now, I'm a bigger proponent of prevention, of course, but if we hope to have clearance rates that are much better than what we have across the board, and this isn't just MPD, but clearance rates have gone down quite a bit across the board. For instance, I was just looking at simple and aggravated assault offenses in Hennepin County. In 2024, the clearance rate was 39%. So still, relatively low, and there are certainly reasons for that. But the reality is the idea of deterrence is really based on the certainty of getting caught, not whatever a punishment or an accountability might be, because if you can't, there's going to be no accountability if you don't get caught.
So I remember you brought this up, I think, in front of the Minneapolis City Council, the clearance rate part.
Yes.
Just as a response, because people in the community have questions, and they're often blaming you based on nothing, really. And you're like, well, if you want to understand why these cases aren't being solved, they're not bringing us cases or not bringing us cases we can charge. And the chief took that personally, I think. There was a couple of times where you and the chief got into it in the press, and he took that personally as if you were swiping at MPD. As I watched the meeting, that's not really how I took it. But have you patched up that relationship with Chief O'Hara? Are you working well together? Is MPD now participating in the intervention program, which I think was another criticism you had earlier?
Yeah, he was not the only person who was upset at me talking about clearance rates. And this is why I said at the time, and I said to you before, this is not meant to be a criticism of law enforcement. It's not meant to be finger pointing. It is meant to figure out what can we do to lower car thefts or any kind of crime. And I compare it to, let's say, a hospital in Minneapolis had really high infection rates, right? And we would want to get to the bottom of that. Why does this hospital have higher infection rates than all of the other hospitals in Minnesota or in Hennepin County or Minneapolis? And if we tried to dig into that, I don't think anybody would accuse us of being anti-hospital or anti-law enforcement. We would all accept the idea that, hey, the infection rates are really high and we got to figure out what's going on there. And is there something that the hospital, the doctor, whatever it is not happening that we can change so we can do better? And I think that that's a real problem in Minneapolis when you're talking, in Minneapolis especially, but this is true other places across the country, that the moment you try to talk about law enforcement, people accuse me of being against cops or anti-law enforcement. And that is not at all true in my case. What I think we need to do to improve public safety, and this applies to all of it, it applies to the county attorney's office, everyone. Where are we seeing the gaps? Where are we seeing places that we can work on? Because the whole idea is, in my opinion, for all of us to be looking at what we're doing and be working together on whatever that thing is so that we can hopefully fix it. And unfortunately, and it's always been interesting to me watching this as a resident of Minneapolis too, that there are people so invested. I don't know exactly what they're invested in, but it's like anytime you bring up anything about MPD, it goes into your anti-cop, where I wish they would realize that they're actually a barrier to helping MPD. I know that there are good cops in MPD, but it's very difficult for them to thrive in an environment and the culture that they have, right? And so we all need to be working together to try to improve that. But we have to be able to talk honestly about what's happening there. We have to be able to talk honestly about what's happening in my office. We have to be able to talk honestly about what judges, what the whole system does. That's what I think hospitals do, right? And it's not to blame people as much as it is to really figure out how we can all do better. And so, as you know, it's very difficult to have those conversations before you kind of get shouted down because you're somehow anti-law enforcement, when it's ironically the opposite. It's like you'd like to have a culture where people who want to be good cops, really want to help the community, can thrive.
It's been a really big whiplash from the George Floyd 2020 to now, where it's kind of like, I don't know if it's a majority position in the city, but like certainly a large minority of people just very angry if you criticize MPD. And from my perspective, I draw a line from the disastrous state of MPD to a lot of the problems we've had over the years. I don't blame the critics for the problems. I blame the problem for the problem, and I'd like to fix it. Yeah. Are you ever concerned that you become such a hot button politically that whenever you are gone from office, maybe the things you are trying to do don't stick, or they become discredited in the public mind because Mary Moriarty just became such a flashpoint politically? Like how do you navigate politics as an elected prosecutor?
I think about that a lot. And when I came into office, one of my goals was to make sure that we were putting structures in place and changing cultures. And this is part of the podcast too, really working with the public to educate everybody about what's actually happening in the system, and to be able to use data to show people that what we're doing works, so that long after I'm gone, community is demanding the same things, the same transparency, the same accountability, and that they understand what they should be asking for. And I'm very well aware that I am often not the best messenger. So, for instance, in the legislature, I often, we may support a bill very much behind the scenes, or somebody else from the office may go testify about it. I am very deeply invested in getting the work done, and I am happy to step away from whatever the situation is to get the work done. I don't need to be at the front of anything, and I'm very well aware of sometimes what the impact of me, being at the front of anything might mean that it might not work. And so I think about that a lot. We do think about structures and putting in place systems that will last. And as I said, the work is much more important to me than who gets credit for it. I don't really care about that. And so I'm happy to step aside and just collaborate with others so that we get the work done.
So tell us how you're different from your predecessor. Like, what do you think are the big things you have changed? Because sometimes I think you may get criticized for things that are probably happening in the same way that they did under your predecessor. Like normal things that would have happened before that are still happening. Now they are your fault. If a big, terrible thing happens, it has always happened. Now it's your fault.
Right.
But maybe there's two questions there. How are you different and how are things the same?
Yeah, I think one big issue where there isn't much difference, and I am trying to change, is this. You've heard and seen some stories about victims and victims' families that are unhappy with what we've done in some given case, or saying that they didn't hear from us in a very timely fashion. An interesting thing to me is I hear all the time, oh, people complained all the time under my predecessor. And this makes sense. We have thousands of cases. We had over 10,000 cases usually every year. And of course, when you are working with people who are grieving, who have been harmed, we actually don't do much in the system that helps them with the harm, with the trauma. And what we have very limited tools. We're trying to expand those tools, but the tools that we have are sometimes incarceration. And often families aren't happy with that. And, for instance, I met with a mom at some point and she wanted the death penalty, which we don't have. I understand why she wanted it, and she had every right to ask for that. But, my job and our job as prosecutors is to take a look at the situation and figure out what's before us and what's in the best interest of public safety. The systemic issue I would like to address is this. It probably comes as a surprise to people that every Monday, that's when the trial calendar is. So that's when felonies are set for trial. There are anywhere between 90 and 120 felonies set for trial every Monday. So that's our prosecutors who have multiple cases on. The trial calendar happens to be a place where finally there's a judge, and the idea is either you settle the case or you go to trial. And so that's a place where a lot of cases settle. Most of the cases settle at that time. And our victim witness people are working with witnesses and victims. And oftentimes there's no talk of settlement until you get to the trial. And then the accused person is saying, well, what are you willing to offer me? And judges give us very little time. Let's say a defendant wants to plead guilty. The judges are saying, okay, when can we get this on the record? And so our victim service specialists are reaching out to victims saying, oh, there's been a settlement in this case. This is what's happening. If you want to come in, you got to get in here in the next hour or so, because the judges give us very little time. And so you'll hear and you'll see in the paper people saying, well, we didn't have any time. They didn't communicate with us. They didn't give us time to process it. They didn't talk to us as much as we would have liked. That always happened. It has always happened. But I never recall seeing that ever in the newspaper as an issue. It is an issue in my mind, and we are taking steps to try to see what we can do to leading up to that trial calendar, be talking to victims and witnesses and victims' families about, well, there hasn't, the defense hasn't given us any indication they're interested in an offer. But by the way, most cases do settle on the day of trial. And so that may happen. So I think we can do a lot of work in helping with the expectations. In terms of what's different, many things, many things. I think, we are successful in changing a lot of the culture here. so that people feel less bound by a bunch of rules, that if something goes wrong, they're not going to get thrown under the bus. It was a very fear-based kind of culture here. We have an emphasis on employee well-being and staff wellness, and trauma-informed practice. We have been working on, so many different preventative programs. What I have told, here's an example, actually. When I came in, the U and T visa policy, what that is if a person who is an immigrant is a victim of a crime, we can do what's called a certification that can help them get temporary status while they are seeking what's called a U or a T visa. So before I came here, the office did not want to certify cases until they were resolved, if ever. But that meant we would lose victims because they wouldn't want to come forward, right? And so I remember talking to our lawyer who was in charge of that, and I said, well, why don't you go away and come up with the policy you would like? And he came back, and I remember reading it, and I said, okay, is this your dream policy, or is this the policy you kind of hoped I would approve? And he said, it's kind of the policy I hoped you would approve. And I said, well, I want you to go away and think big. What's your dream policy? So he went away and did that. And he came back, and we now have what's been called a model policy nationally on UNT visas. And that's the kind of work our staff has been doing. I saw another example is I saw a real need there on extreme risk protection orders, red flag law. Most people don't know we have it in Minnesota, but that came through the legislature last year. It came into place, or was effective 2024. And every town USA reached out to me and said, hey, do you need any help with implementation of your new, what we call ERPO, extreme risk protection order law? And I said, oh, I don't know. Do we, and so we were having conversations, and I realized that the law was very confusing for law enforcement, for prosecutors. People weren't entirely sure how to do it, what a petition looked like. So I hired a woman named Raina Alexander, who's an expert in this area, to be kind of the point person for the entire county. And she has done tremendous work in providing technical assistance for law enforcement, training, community groups, and just all around helping everybody figure out how to implement what I think is a very important law. And the stories I have heard, here's one of them. Household, you can file one if you're a household member. So a family of a woman became very concerned about her because she said she was going to go buy a gun and harm herself. And so they filed for an ERPO. They got it right away. And it turned out the woman went to some store where you could buy a gun. And when she tried to buy the gun and the store properly put in the data, a flag came up because of the ERPO. And so she was not allowed to buy a gun. Now, I would like to believe that gave her some time to really think through and perhaps have a change of mind about hurting herself with a gun. But that's the kind of work that Raina's been doing and helping all of law enforcement in Hennepin County. So I have been trying to think through our whole staff. I've said to people, what are the problems that we're facing here? And how do we solve those problems? And so, I have a list of innovative programs that we've come up with, many, many things that we're working on that I'm very proud of. And I have told people here too, we are going to rely on data and research. I have no interest in doing things that don't work just because, it's a whatever policy, what have you. I want to do things that work. I would say another big thing, and I promised myself when I came into office, and I did talk about it in my campaign, that we were not going to make decisions based on the political winds or whatever. And I can honestly say that that's been true. And I think it's been pretty obvious that we don't make decisions based on what would be good for me politically. That's been very obvious. Sometimes the decision itself has been fairly straightforward and easy, but the consequences have been pretty hard. And I realize how hard it is if you had career aspirations, if you were a politician using this as a stepping stone for some other office, that I understand now how hard it can be to make decisions based on what really is the right thing to do. And I know that we do that, and I also know that is not what was happening in the past.
So you're not running for governor is what you're saying?
I am not running for governor or Senate or anything else. I mean, I'm really invested in this job. This is my wheelhouse in terms of this has been my entire career. I'm familiar with the system, familiar with the work, familiar with the people, and we're just really invested in trying to make the community safer.
How about the Brady List stuff? I know that was a thing that was talked about in the 2022 campaign.
Yes.
And I remember articles last year where it was like, oh, Mary Moriarty has not followed through on her campaign promise yet. What's going on? And then I think you announced something. Like, where are we with that? And maybe for the audience, explain what a Brady List is, because I would be very bad at that.
Yeah, I'm very proud of that. Actually, we have... So Brady, what is Brady? Prosecutors have a constitutional obligation to give the defense evidence that might be favorable to the defense. And, Brady Giglio is not limited to law enforcement, but it is primarily about law enforcement. And the big, one moment here, the sun, can you... I see I'm surrounded. My face is right in the sun.
You're on fire.
I'm on
Mary
fire.
Moriarty is on fire.
I am on fire. Yeah. So the big issue there is that this office was handing over final discipline, which was public. What the office was not doing was getting private data and disclosing that appropriately to the defense. And so what that meant is this kind of relates to coaching too. Police departments have different matrices for what they consider to be a coaching thing, what they consider to be various types of discipline, which is their business. They can handle that in whatever way, they think is appropriate. But it doesn't change our obligations. So they may decide that something is coaching where we know we have an obligation to disclose that to the defense. But you can't get at it because it's non-public information if it's coaching. So what we have done, and I'm very proud of this, and I wish the same people who were writing, I haven't fulfilled my campaign promises, would write about the fact that we have an amazing Brady team that's just done fabulous work. We do get non-public data. And by the way, just because we disclose something, we can always argue in court that it should not be admissible in a given case. Like, it just isn't relevant to whatever the issue is in the case. And we will do that. But I am feeling pretty confident that we are disclosing to the defense what we need to disclose under the Constitution. And that's been a huge change for this office, and one I'm very proud of. And it does, if you want to think about, let's say, some of the conduct that we saw on video after George Floyd. Well, let's talk about Jaleel Stallings. For your listeners, Jaleel Stallings was a military veteran who was outside during some of the unrest with George Floyd. He thought he had been shot by a rubber bullet, essentially. And so he went and he got his gun and he shot back it was an unmarked van, and he thought he had been shot by somebody in the unmarked van. So he shot, and I believe most of the bullet hit the ground, kind of thing. When he realized it was actually MPD in that van, he immediately tossed the gun and placed himself face first, as you would. And unfortunately, what we see on video was a member of MPD coming up, running up, and kicking him in the face, which ended up fracturing a cheekbone. That officer was later charged by the Attorney General. So, but that was not, he was not disciplined for that in any public way. And so the office would not have had that information to disclose to defense that the officer had done something which we certainly would be required to disclose under Brady. But the fact now that we get the non-public info, meaning it may not have gone through the process, the disciplinary process, it may have been coached, it may have been whatever, it doesn't matter what the police department did. We have lists of the kinds of things that we need law enforcement to give us so that we can potentially disclose it. If it is non-public information, we disclose it under a court order. So it's not as though that officer's information is floating out there in the ether. It is something that we have to disclose, we can argue is still not admissible. So I'm very proud of the fact that we are disclosing that information. And here's why it's important. You certainly want a person who's accused to get a fair trial and have the information that they're entitled to have. But here's the other big deal. We have seen cases across the country where they come back later because somebody looks in the file and sees that there was Brady material there that was never disclosed. Then you have to go through the process of opening up that case, which can be very painful for a person who might have been a victim in that case. That case might get thrown out. You might have to retry it. And so why not do it right in the first place? Disclose what we need to disclose. We can argue in court as to whether it comes in. And so we don't need to worry about the fact that something's going to be, that was hidden in a file or just not disclosed, comes out later and undoes what happened in court.
The case of State Trooper Ryan Londregan, who shot Ricky Cobb during a traffic stop, you got beat up real bad for that. And I was extremely frustrated that hardly any attention at all was paid to the fact that it was a botched traffic stop. And I think it is a scandal that we have state police who apparently conduct traffic stops this way. And maybe they aren't trained how to do it properly. Because the extent of my police training is watching way too many episodes of Cops, like 20 and 30 years ago. But as they're conducting this, you can tell that these cops expect he might drive away. It's in their mind, this guy is a big risk to drive away. And so what do? They put themselves into the car and get themselves tangled up. And it's detailed in the special prosecutors. I don't know if that's what they were called, the report about how botched this traffic stop was. Ultimately, the charges were dropped against the trooper. But no discussion of our state police conducting traffic stops this way in a way that gets someone killed and it shouldn't have happened. And everybody just wants to beat up on you. And I guess I don't know what my question is. I'm just I can't get over the fact that we're not talking about the way our state police do traffic stops.
One thing that, there are many things that still bother me about that case, but one thing that was very painful to watch was how the family was treated, the family of Ricky Cobb and his twin brother. To see people talking about Londregan as being the victim there was really hard. Because, and I know some police officers who thought it was appropriately charged, who wouldn't say that publicly. But regardless of whether you think it was properly charged or should have been charged, that shouldn't have happened, right? And everybody should be working to make sure that nothing like that ever happens again. And I happen to know some police departments have done training on how to avoid that happening. So the fact that conversation never happened is really disappointing. And it may go to, when you said the pendulum has really swung. How did we get from 2020 and George Floyd to a space where we're in the government center and the victim's family has to walk through a line of people supporting Londregan who are giving the victim's family a hard time. And I remember very clearly somebody holding a sign. I think it was somebody in law enforcement holding a sign at one of the appearances. I think the first appearance I'm pointing over there because it's a public safety facility. Somebody was holding a sign that said something about thugs. And they meant, Ricky Cobb. And then the other half of the sign was about me. And I thought, oh my God, this poor family who's lost their loved one has to walk through, this whole, the number of people who showed up to protest Londregan, what was happening to Londregan, as opposed to recognizing, hey, we might not agree with charging or the level of charging, but hey, this shouldn't have happened. And we should be exploring ways of making sure it doesn't happen again. Instead, what we saw was a lot of, what you often see with somebody who was shot and killed. They were talking about the gun that Ricky Cobb had, which, the BCA made clear was in the back of the car, right? He wasn't going for the gun, but yet you've got people talking about he had a gun and the officers were afraid. And clearly the troopers were not afraid of his gun. I mean, we would have heard that. And, the whole he had a history, as though he deserved whatever his history might have been with the court system, that somehow he deserved what happened to him. And so there were many, many things said by people publicly in positions of power and otherwise that were really, really disappointing and frankly, extremely hurtful to that family.
I think Governor Walz, instead of stepping into a place where he should have no role, you're the prosecutor, he's the governor. Maybe I wish he would spend some time making sure the State Patrol, which I think their primary function is traffic stops, know how to do traffic stops. The State Patrol that he is the boss of. I would hope he did that. Is there any indication that he has done that as State Patrol? Do you know if they have changed their training?
My understanding is, at least the communications that they put out were that he did nothing wrong. He followed his policy. One thing that is a big disappointment about that, too, is that a number of people that the BCA tried to interview at the State Patrol just simply refused to cooperate. And these, certainly we understand if somebody could be charged with a crime, they have every right not to cooperate. But these were people who were doing training. These were people that were not facing any potential criminal prosecution, simply would not cooperate with an investigation. And, later on, we had affidavits filed by trainers that the defense brought up in court for the first time, which was one of the reasons why we reached a point where, and this was outlined in the report, actually, that it was properly charged, but that we reached a point when we saw the affidavits of what people would testify to, that I felt that we could not in good faith go any further. Now, I want to be clear here. We could have tried that case. The judge, we had probable cause, which is all that's required to go to trial, actually, but the defense withdrew its motion to dismiss for probable cause because the judge was going to find it. So we had every legal right to go forward. We could have tried the case, kind of let the chips fall where they may. But I'm a big believer in you go to trial and anything can happen with a jury. And if we don't think, and I've told our staff this, that we can prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt, and in this particular case it's disprove what the officer was going to say, then we shouldn't leave that person up to, say, the whim of a jury. And I think we made what was the responsible, appropriate, ethical decision not to go forward at that point, not the political decision, which would have been to go forward and let the chips fall where they may. And if a jury acquits him, I could have said, well, we disagree with the jury, it's the jury, whatever. And I wasn't going to do that. And that was something else that I think was important for our office to see, that, a lot of times we have a case, and sometimes we just, when things develop and you learn more information, if you no longer have the case, then dismiss it. That is the ethical right thing to do. And I've said to our staff, you're not going to get criticized for, it's not like you're changing I expect you to always be looking at the evidence as it comes in and always be assessing whether it's changed your case, whether you can still prove it. And that's what we did in that case. And I don't think a lot of people, I think it was very confusing for people because we had some suspicion through the grapevine that the governor was going to take the case. And actually, one of the things that we could have done and we did discuss was, well, just let him take it. He's going to dismiss it, right? Even though I'll tell you, he never called me. Nobody ever called me to ask me or our people about what we had in the case. But I was unwilling. So like, I think we learned on a weekend or maybe a Friday that the governor might take it the following Monday or Tuesday or something like that. And so we had a decision to make. Well, let him take it and just dismiss it and kind of see where, what happens there. But here was my concern. The family, the family was treated terribly. The family was treated terribly. And we had a good relationship with the family. And I wanted them to hear this from us, which was a really hard conversation to have with them. And we ended up having it with them, I think, on a Sunday. I didn't want them to hear about a case getting taken away and dismissed through the press. And I was afraid that was going to happen. We didn't dismiss it because of pressure from the governor or anything like that. We dismissed it. We had planned on dismissing it because it was the right thing to do. We just could no longer prove the case as we could when we charged it. And I care about the family, and I wanted them to hear it from us. And that was painful in many ways. But that is another example of, in my mind, doing the right thing and not really thinking about the political consequences of, just let the governor take it like he's planning to take it and, let the, chips fall where they may. We didn't do that. And that was misinterpreted in a lot of ways. But, it kind of is what it is. And I know we did the right thing.
Do you have an update on the status of, so you and Councilmember Payne, and I don't know if you were the only authors on that commentary in the Star Tribune about not having adequate space in Hennepin County, like facilities for young offenders who are just like, can't be out in public, they're a risk to the public. Is there any update to that?
Yeah, so the exact issue is this, that there are a really small number of young people, and I'm talking 10, 11, 12, 13, they're very young, they're children. And these are some of the young people that you hear MPD talk about. And you asked me at one point, it's easy to talk about a revolving door, that kind of thing, right? So they're this group of young people, relatively small group, MPD, police know who they are, we know who they are, but they fall into this difficult age group and category where they really aren't safe at home. But some of them at that age are what we refer to as legally incompetent. So if you think about this, if you think the legal system is hard to understand, imagine trying to explain the legal system to a 12-year-old. So they, just because of developmental issues, they simply don't understand the nature of the court proceeding enough to be able to have us, if you want to prosecute a case. which is understandable. They're just too young, and they're just not going to be competent. But the law says a child who is incompetent cannot be held in the juvenile detention center. That's just improper. They must be released. So what do you do when a child who's engaging in what would be referred to as delinquent behavior is incompetent and cannot legally be held at the juvenile detention center? What do you do? So what's happened is that they have been released, sometimes to, mom, grandma, aunt, something like that, with a bracelet on, and then they cut the bracelet off, and then they're on, stealing cars and engaging in risky behavior. And so that was the crux of that issue, right? We need placement options for those young people because we don't have them in Hennepin County. And in fact, Hennepin County had contracted with a place in Utah. I mean, we were sending kids out of the state because the places in Minnesota simply, the percentage of Hennepin kids that they would take in greater Minnesota was very low. So the difficulty was, and still remains, there is no place to put those children where they will get the services that they need in a secure, in-community setting. So when I say secure in-community, you can often kids do really well in a structured environment. But if you send them off to Utah to be in a structured environment, they can do really well. But what happens when they come back? They go right back into the community, hanging around the same people, and without that structure, they end up back, in doing the same behaviors that they did. What they need is, in some cases, they need a secure setting, but in community, so that their family, so that their therapists, so all of those connections are in community. And we need step-down options. So when they're ready to be released from that secure setting in community, they don't just go right back to their family. There's a step down, a lesser kind of structure so that they can adjust to that. And we don't have it. And so I think that's, I'm very proud of being our office has been really leading on this issue, I think, I testified at the legislature, not this year, but last year, about how we need money to be able to create those options. Now, there was a task force created to study the issue. Hennepin County has really now taken the lead on it and has created a working group to make legislative proposals about what should happen to create those options. Now, one of the things we don't want is some kind of regional facility. Kids don't need to be locked up in a regional facility. As I said, they need to be in community, in some of them secure settings. So we continue to advocate for those kinds of settings. But that was what that op-ed piece was about, and it does still remain a problem.
So you, let me see if I phrase this correctly, are the leader of the largest public law office in the state of Minnesota. Did I phrase that right? Yes. And so I wonder, you hear about Trump administration cuts affecting various levels of government, from law enforcement to cities. Have any of those cuts affected your office in any way?
So we're an office of over 500. When, the day that they announced they were cutting federal funding, I think we, like everybody else, had kind of emergency meetings to figure out what federal funding we were getting in terms of grants, and to figure out, okay, if we lose that, how many human beings do we have in those positions, and can we fund them out of our budget if we lose that funding? So we are fortunate in that we didn't have that many people in those positions, and then that got rescinded or blocked in court. I can't even remember at this point. And so it didn't come to that. What really will hurt everybody, and our office as well, is if federal funding, the whole sanctuary city, I guess that's what they call it, blocking funding, that is going to hurt the entire state of Minnesota, but particularly in our area, the services that people get, so courts send somebody to a service or we contract with a nonprofit, those nonprofits are going to be badly harmed by this. And I talked in one of my press conferences about domestic violence, that many of the all of the nonprofits practically that help victims of domestic violence are funded federally, and some of them will have to close. I mean, they just can't exist without federal funding, and that's really going to hurt public safety. And so I've talked about that quite a bit. We have our Domestic Abuse Service Center, which is a place where anyone can walk in and receive services and help if they're the victim of domestic violence. And we partner with a lot of different community organizations that are there on site to help people. We have staff who speak over 10 languages. All kinds of culturally specific nonprofits are part of DASC. That's what we call it. If federal funding goes away, those nonprofits are probably not going to be able to survive, and that they are what make up DASC, the Domestic Abuse Service Center. So I would say our office, the county would be hit hard. Our office, not as much. However, the services that are provided to people for rehabilitation for domestic violence are really going to be hurt. And of course, that is going to hurt public safety.
So your podcast is called We Don't Have to Choose, and I encourage everyone to listen. But what you do have to choose here at the end are some recommendations for the audience. What do you enjoy doing lately? What's fun? How do you relax? What should other people take up?
What should other people take up? Gardening.
Okay.
I love gardening. I love to sit on a pontoon and read books. Unfortunately, I read too many books that are about work, which I enjoy. Other people may not. I think especially now, just trying to lean into joy. And so and we tell our people this in the office, you bring your whole self to work, and you need, because we look at some terrible, awful video, that's traumatizing. People need to figure out what brings them joy, and take breaks and disconnect and go feel joy, I think, especially now. So that would be my pitch to anyone. Like, I love gardening. I love, walking around the lakes, all of that kind of thing. But whatever gives you joy, I think, is something that we all really need to lean into these days.
We do need that. I can't focus anymore. I'm so scatterbrained at the collapse of this country that I love. On a daily basis. I cannot focus on important things because of what's happening in the country.
I agree, and I think what saved me a little bit is I don't have time to doom scroll.
Right.
And what I really think has been good for me is I try to not do that, and it seems like not doing that, then something that's been declared from the administration has been rescinded or blocked by the court by the time I hear about it, and then I don't have to worry about it.
Yes.
That's been helpful to me.
If I step away for like 2 minutes, I feel like I'm out of the loop on all the things that have happened and then been retracted.
I agree. It's just it's just a terrible time and a very fearful time, and I worry about all the support and safety net systems that are there for people that may very well go away, and are just going to put all of us in a worse position. It's really tough times right now. I feel somewhat energized by the fact that I am in a position to speak out against some of these things, and that we in the office are able to also help in the ways that we're able to help. But I realize that's kind of a small drop in the bucket to what people are facing.
Well, thank you, Mary Moriarty, Hennepin County Attorney and host of the podcast We Don't Have to Choose. This has been the Wedge Life Podcast. I'm your host, John Edwards. Thank you for listening.
This is a real thing. Real thing.
None of
going on today?
We're in the Wedge neighborhood right now, 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 right now.